Greetings everyone. Welcome to today's lecture on poverty and social exclusion, which is part of the ongoing series on inequality and difference. In this lecture, I would be talking about the key points related to the meaning of social exclusion, the causes of social exclusion, the consequences of social exclusion, and also some discussion about socially excluded people in different parts of India and also world. Let us first begin with the very idea of India that was visualized as a part of Jawaharlal Nehru's address to the Constituent Assembly in 1947. So the idea was as follows: to bring freedom and opportunity to the common man, to the peasants and workers of India, to fight and end poverty and ignorance and disease, to build up a prosperous, democratic and progressive nation, and to create social, economic and political institutions which will ensure justice and fullness of life to every man and woman. So today we can ask a question that have all these motives been fulfilled, or what are the issues that still remain unanswered and unresolved? Studies show that poverty level is very high and concentrated in specific groups. So the social, ethnic, cultural, gender, race, religion and other group identities become very important when we are talking about poverty. And there are definite consequences of exclusion again on the cycle of poverty. Then we also must discuss several remedies that one can suggest in order to end exclusion and also to reduce poverty. Now, a question that arises here is that why should we care about social exclusion? Because due to social exclusion, human rights cannot be enjoyed by everyone. So, reducing social exclusion will also reduce poverty worldwide and would also help in achieving Millennium Development Goals within the stipulated time span. Now, before we go on further, let us talk about the definition of social exclusion. So, how do we define social exclusion? It can be defined as groups of people existing in all societies who are systematically disadvantaged because they are discriminated against, and this can occur in public institutions such as legal system or in education, in health services, as well as within the household and the larger community. So, another question that arises here is that how do people become excluded? Exclusion occurs when powerful groups of society create institutions and promote specific behaviors that reflect or enforce current social attitudes. So, there is no room that is left for people who are different. So, unofficial discriminations, they kind of reflect the society's ideals, and because people are unaware of others' needs. So, for example, those who are specially abled or those who are born with some kind of deficiency are not really catered to by the majority. Now, how does poverty connect to social exclusion? One can say that men, women and children who are excluded from society are also often excluded from participation in the economy or in politics. Therefore, they are more likely to remain marginalized, throughout their lifespan, and also they continue to remain poor. So reducing poverty becomes a very tough cycle to break, and even after so many years of independence, India has not really succeeded in breaking this cycle successfully. Now a question that arises here is that, can social exclusion cause poverty? Currently, millions of people world over experience discrimination based on their ethnic, linguistic or religious identities. Because socially excluded groups don't have access to resources, markets or other public services in the same way, they do not have an opportunity to enhance their income by their own efforts or by their own skill sets. So, one can give some transnational examples of poverty, hunger and exclusion. So, for example, in Vietnam, 90% of the country is made up of ethnic minorities, and 100 million older people live on less than $1 a day. And women account for nearly 70% of the 1.2 billion people living in extreme poverty. Now, if one is talking about maternal health and child mortality, then one can give example of Brazil, where nearly 3 times as many colored women as compared to white women die from the complications of pregnancy and childbirth. In India, discrimination of girls increases the child mortality rate by 20%. Then another example can be given of Guatemala, where 79 out of 1000 indigenous babies and children die before their 5th birthday. So, the problem is also rampant as far as something as basic as education is taken into account. So, for example, in Serbia and Montenegro, 30% of Roma children have never attended primary school. And in UP, the primary school enrollment for girls among the low castes is much lower as compared to the higher castes. Now, another very important issue that one can talk about when we are talking about social exclusion is gender equality. Women hold fewer than 13% of the world's parliamentary seats and less than 9% of the seats in developing countries, with a few exceptions. So, between 16 to 50% of women in relationships have been physically assaulted by their partners at some point of their lives. And if one is talking about diseases like HIV, AIDS, malaria and some other diseases, so for example in China, although ethnic minorities make up less than 9% of the population, they account for more than 37% of HIV cases. In Africa, 8% of 15 to 19-year-old aged population is living with HIV and AIDS, and these fall in the category of women. In Guatemala also, 90% of children of European descent are vaccinated against measles as compared to 70% of indigenous people, again showing that there is discrepancy and discrimination even at the level of child care. So, invariably, this kind of social exclusion also encourages conflict, and excluded groups are often denied a voice in politics as they are denied a voice in economy. So, when they feel too abused and marginalized, they invariably react violently, or they may feel that violence will give them power or give a vent to their pent up energies. And one can again give example of Guatemala, who has experienced a prolonged civil war and also the genocide that took place in Rwanda. So, the economic and the non-economic factors both are very important if one is trying to understand the causes of social exclusion. So, social exclusion is denial of equal opportunity in markets as well as in non-market exchange to specific groups. Now, when we are talking about non-economic nature of exclusion, then we can say that it is embedded in social relations. It involves denial of access to sources of income, education, civil rights, governance, and then one can also talk about individual versus group exclusion. Now, coming to the consequences of exclusion, these are definitely grave and some are measurable while some are not. On economic growth, there is definitely an indirect impact, and the discrimination leads to imperfect market situation and imperfect mobilization of resources, which brings less than optimum allocation of resources as well as product formation. So, the economic outcome becomes less than optimum, and another very important consequence is that of unemployment, then the issue of civil rights as well as lack of participation, low ownership of income earning assets, wage earning, skill, education, employability, all these become very important and crucial issues. And all these factors are increasingly being experienced by lower income groups. Then the civil and political rights are also a very important indicators that kind of point out to lack of participation in political process as well as governance. Then intergroup inequality and inequality again fosters intergroup conflict. Now, coming to the resolution and what are the remedies that one can suggest against exclusion, then one can talk about dual strategy. So, one part of the strategy would deal with the compensatory measures of economic or educational empowerment. So, this basically means redistribution of land and non-land assets. Then also capital, entrepreneur as well as skill formation for enhancing business skills, and also not to neglect educational development, provision of housing, social amenities, etc. And at another level, one can talk about equal opportunity policy. And when we are talking about equal opportunity policy, some specific measures that one can talk about are legal safeguards, anti-discrimination laws, then equal and fair share in income earning as well as assets. Then dealing with the issues of employment, education, housing, all this can also be incorporated as part of affirmative action, which has been a very important part of our constitution also. Then also one can talk about executive and governance and making invisible visible in data system. So, unless and until there is a regular flow of data and census information is there in the public domain, one does not know, and even the government will have no idea as to which are the specific groups that need specific kind of strategies to help them come out of exclusion and join the mainstream, whether it is in the field of education or employment or skill formation. Now there are some focus areas, and these focus areas are generally take into account the traditionally excluded groups and how they have fared during the period of rapid growth. So a question that can be asked here is that have the traditionally excluded groups fared well during the period of rapid growth which the country was experiencing post independence? So here one can focus on scheduled castes, scheduled tribes and women, but there are some other groups also like OBCs, people with disabilities and some minorities. So when we talk about data collection and how data can help us in knowing more about these marginalized groups, then one can talk about NSS, NFHS and some other qualitative research work that is going on in this field. However, one should not only be particular or be specific about the outcomes, but also the processes. So income, poverty and inequality are elements of social exclusion, and they don't really capture the essence of exclusion or exclusionary tactics. And even where Gini coefficients do not show high levels of inequality, there could be serious exclusion of some groups. Gini coefficient is a statistical measure of the degree of variation represented in a set of values that is used especially in measuring income inequality, and this is largely used in order to indicate the level and extent of inequality. And aggregate data does not capture heterogeneity. Now this is another problem with statistics and various statistical tools that must be taken into account. So what we need, what the social scientists need, is some kind of a triangulation of data where both the quantitative as well as qualitative analysis is taken recourse to. Then one can also talk about global dimensions. It is not as if only countries like India are experiencing poverty and social exclusion. This is a problem that is not limited to one or two countries only. There are global dimensions and there are excluded communities that one can talk about even in the developed world. For example, Roma in Europe and a large number of migrant workers in the developed countries, then caste in India and Nepal, and people of African descent in countries like Brazil are discriminated against, and then also indigenous people the world over have been discriminated. So there are some common features that one can identify, which are like some kind of a stigmatization and stereotyping particular communities, groups, marginalized sections with historical underpinnings. Then also identifying characteristics like race, caste, religion, region with a certain mindset, and also a poorer access to assets, markets, services, business opportunities, production, etc. And finally, a low voice in decision making. So when all these factors work hand in glove, what happens is exclusion. There are specific groups that can be identified in the context of India who can be considered as socially excluded still. For example, the scheduled tribes who have been facing poverty and deprivation, and also this is indicated in the form of excess mortality of tribal children, which shows that these groups are still lacking basic health facilities and natal care. Then another group that can be identified is that of Dalits, and again their discrimination can be indicated from the labor market outcomes, the salaries that Dalits are earning as compared to the upper caste individuals. Then another group that one can identify is that of women. When we can talk about health and survival outcomes, or when we can talk about various kinds of insecurities and also the disadvantage that they face in the labor market as well as in the household. So talking about scheduled tribes, there has been a systematic failure in giving the tribals a stake in the modern economic processes that inexorably intrudes into their living spaces, because the tribal areas are also the areas which are very rich in all kind of mineral resources, water resources. So therefore this intrusion into their space is finally eroding their habitat, eroding their resources that they had been using since time immemorial. I have already dealt in detail with this aspect of tribes when I was doing this topic as part of the series on inequality and difference. So for a detailed reference, you are advised to refer to those lectures. Now the alienation that has built over decades is now taking a violent turn in some parts of our country, and relatively slower decline in poverty meant that there was more concentration of scheduled tribes in the poorest deciles of the population, and in most states with high tribal populations, poverty rates for STs were higher than the average tribal poverty rate across the nation as a whole. For example, in Orissa, it was as high as 75%. And as you can see from this graph, the scheduled tribes in 2004-2005 were 20 years behind the average population in terms of poverty. Another very important dimension of tribal deprivation, as I just mentioned, is child mortality. STs have higher child mortality rates than the rest of the population, nearly 96 tribal children dying for every 1,000 births, compared to under 5 mortality of 74 per 1,000 for the average Indian child, as per NFHS survey 2005. So ST children make up nearly 12% of all children below the age of 5 in rural areas, but account for 23% of all deaths. Between the age of 1 and 5, that is, a disproportionate number of children are dying in rural areas, and these are tribal children. So child mortality rates have stagnated among STs in rural areas over successive NFHS rounds, which is really alarming. Now, breaking down under 5 mortality by age, one finds that tribal children are on par with others at the time of birth, but they fall well behind by the time they are 5 years old. This divergence is more striking as compared to SC children, who also face disadvantages. And there are so many other findings which point to these kind of discriminatory practices, which I would be sharing soon. Thanks a lot.